Nobody expected Canada to do this. For decades, literally decades, the assumption in Washington was simple: push Canada hard enough, and Canada folds. Apply economic pressure, rattle the cage, threaten the relationship, and Ottawa would come crawling back to the negotiating table, hat in hand, ready to accept whatever terms Washington offered. That was the playbook. Everyone knew it. Everyone expected it to work again. It didn't. What Canada did instead, what has been quietly unfolding over the last 14 months, is not just a retaliation. It is not just a counter move on a trade chessboard. What Canada has done is something far more consequential, far more permanent, and far more alarming for anyone in Washington who was counting on Canada to eventually break. Canada didn't just fight back against the tariffs. Canada used the tariffs as a reason to fundamentally transform itself, its alliances, its economy, its military posture, and its place in the global order. And the world is watching. Stay with me, because what we're about to walk through is one of the most significant geopolitical pivots of any Western democracy in the modern era, and it all started with a threat that was supposed to be simple. Let's go back to February 1st, 2025. That is the day President Donald Trump signed an executive order that would change the relationship between the United States and Canada forever. The order imposed a 25% tariff on most Canadian goods entering the United States and a 10% tariff specifically on Canadian energy exports and critical minerals. The stated justification was national security and what the administration described as insufficient action on fentanyl smuggling at the border. Canada supplies approximately 60% of the fentanyl entering the United States. That was the public argument. Critics immediately pointed out that Canada's share of fentanyl seizures at the US-Canada border was a fraction of what crosses from Mexico. But no matter. The order was signed, the tariffs were coming, and here's what made it more than just a tariff dispute. Trump had, for months leading up to this, been calling Canada the 51st state, not as a joke, not as offhand commentary, repeatedly, persistently, with a straight face. He had called Canada's Prime Minister governor, a deliberate act of political degradation. He had mused openly about using economic force to bring Canada into the American fold. His advisors were briefing that the goal was to make Canada economically dependent enough that annexation became, in their words, a rational choice. That was the context. This was not a routine trade disagreement between neighbors. This was a coordinated pressure campaign designed to destabilize a sovereign nation and reshape North American political geography to serve Washington's interests. When the tariffs officially came into effect on March 4th, 2025, Canada responded. 30 billion Canadian dollars worth of retaliatory tariffs hitting American steel, aluminum, consumer goods, and agricultural products landed simultaneously. Canada had prepared for this. The response was not frantic or chaotic. It was methodical, surgical, and it carried a message that no press conference could have delivered as clearly. Canada was not going to absorb this quietly. But that was just the first move. Here's the thing that most coverage of this story misses entirely. The tariff war was always asymmetric on paper. The United States economy is roughly 10 times the size of Canada's. Canada sends approximately 75% of its total exports to the United States. That dependency, analysts had argued for years, was Canada's Achilles heel. It was the reason Washington believed it held all the cards. Why fight back hard when you need the other side more than they need you? That logic had held for 40 years of integrated North American trade, but Trump's team made a strategic miscalculation that no algorithm, no economic model, and no briefing note had apparently flagged for them. They underestimated what happens to a nation when you threaten its identity. The moment Trump started calling Canada the 51st state, something shifted in the Canadian psyche that no tariff revenue can buy back. Canadians, who historically define themselves in subtle contrast to their southern neighbor, their universal health care, their multiculturalism, their rejection of American-style political extremism, suddenly had something visceral to push against. The polling numbers told the story. Within weeks of the annexation comments, Canadian nationalism spiked to levels pollsters hadn't recorded in a generation. Buy Canadian movements swept through cities and towns. American flags were being taken down from businesses. Canadian flags were going up where they'd never flown before. And into that moment walked Mark Carney, Carney, the former governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, was not a conventional political figure. He had never run for office before the March 2025 federal election, but he understood economics at a level that very few heads of government in the world did, and he had been watching the tariff escalation with the cold, calculating eye of a central banker who has navigated financial crises before. He won the election, and his mandate was explicit: defend Canada's sovereignty, rebuild Canada's economic independence, and never let a foreign government use trade as a weapon against this country again. The question was, how? Because here's the brutal math Trump's team had right: a full-scale tariff war would be genuinely devastating for Canada. Economists at Serrano, the Canadian Research Institute, modeled it out. A sustained tariff war could produce a 4.2% GDP decline in Canada and cost roughly 700,000 jobs. That's not a recession. That's a generational economic wound. For a country of 40 million people, those are numbers that shake governments, topple leaders, and create social instability. So Canada had a choice, a stark, unambiguous choice: accept the pain, negotiate from weakness, and sign whatever deal Washington offered, which, based on the signals coming out of the Trump administration, would likely have involved significant concessions on agriculture, intellectual property, and border enforcement that would set Canada's negotiating position back by decades, or use the crisis as a forcing function, use the tariffs as the burning platform that finally compelled Canada to do what it had been talking about but never fully committing to for 30 years: diversify, reduce dependency, build new alliances. Reassert sovereignty not just rhetorically, but structurally, economically, and militarily. Canada chose the second path, and what it has done since that choice is genuinely extraordinary. Let's talk about what Canada actually built in the middle of a trade war, because this is the part of the story that changes everything. First, the economic pivot. Canada sits, largely unappreciated, at the center of one of the most powerful trade frameworks in the world. It has 15 free trade agreements covering 51 countries, giving it preferential access to markets representing 61% of global GDP and 1.5 billion consumers. That infrastructure existed before Trump, but it had never been activated at scale because, frankly, it didn't need to be. The American market was so large, so accessible, so integrated that Canadian businesses defaulted to it by instinct. The tariffs changed the math overnight. By mid-2025, Canadian exports to Europe had surged 22% year over year. Exports to Africa were up 18%. Exports to Central and South America had climbed 11%. Canada launched active negotiations toward a new free trade framework with ASEAN, the 10-nation Southeast Asian bloc that represents one of the fastest-growing consumer markets on Earth. Prime Minister Carney publicly declared that Canada would pursue an ambitious goal: doubling its non-American exports entirely. Let that land for a moment. Canada, a country that had built its entire modern economic identity around integration with the United States, publicly committed to a strategy of cutting its American economic dependency in half. That is not a negotiating tactic. That is a structural transformation. But Carney was not only playing the economic game, he was playing the diplomatic game simultaneously, and playing it with a level of strategic sophistication that caught Washington flat-footed. As Trump escalated the tariffs through the summer and autumn of 2025, raising the rate to 35% on non-USMCA goods in August, then tacking on an additional 10% in October after an Ontario government advertisement quoted Ronald Reagan criticizing protectionism, Canada did not retreat to bilateral negotiations. It went global, and then came Oslo. On March 15, 2026, Prime Minister Mark Carney flew to Norway, not for a routine diplomatic visit, not for a photo opportunity. He was there to sit down with the prime ministers of Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, and Iceland, the 5 Nordic nations, for what would become the most consequential Canadian foreign policy summit in decades. The agenda was Arctic security. The subtext was something larger. These are nations that share something profound with Canada right now. They are all navigating a world in which their most powerful ally, the United States, has become unpredictable, transactional, and in some cases actively threatening. Trump had declared his intention to acquire Greenland, a Danish territory, and had not backed down. He had questioned the validity of NATO obligations. He had made clear that American security commitments were conditional, not permanent, and that the price of American protection was compliance with American economic demands. For Canada and the Nordic nations, that calculation had shifted everything. At the Oslo summit, Carney stood before cameras and said something that Canadian prime ministers simply do not say. He was asked directly by Danish media whether Canada would commit to defending Greenland against any attempt by the United States to annex it. And Carney answered without hesitation, "We stand foursquare behind the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity. It is for the people of Greenland and Denmark to decide their futures. We will back that with measures as necessary." Read that again. The Canadian Prime Minister was standing in Norway, publicly signaling that Canada would take measures, military measures, diplomatic measures, whatever was necessary to back the sovereignty of Greenland against the territorial ambitions of the United States of America. That is not normal. That is not routine alliance management. That is a country drawing a line in a place no one expected it to draw one. The joint communiqué signed at Oslo pledged deepening defense industrial cooperation across all 6 nations. It specifically noted the strategic importance of the Arctic corridor. It came in the direct aftermath of an Atlantic Council report warning that Russia's war economy had proven more resilient than expected, that Moscow had effectively transitioned to a permanent wartime footing, and that NATO's northern flank faced 5 distinct scenarios of Russian provocation, 3 of which involved seizure of key Nordic islands to test alliance resolve. Canada walked out of Oslo not as a secondary player looking for shelter under NATO's umbrella. Canada walked out as an Arctic power, reasserting its relevance and doing it loudly, publicly, and on its own terms. Now let's zoom out because the full picture is extraordinary. 3 days before the Oslo summit, on March 12, 2026, Prime Minister Carney stood in a military hangar in Yellowknife, surrounded by Canadian Armed Forces personnel, and announced what analysts are already calling the most significant Canadian defense investment since the Cold War. 32 billion Canadian dollars, approximately $23.5 billion US, to build 3 new military bases in Canada's northern territories, including one in Yellowknife itself, with improvements at an existing base in Labrador. An additional 2.67 billion Canadian dollars for 2 operational support nodes, essentially military service stations for aircraft and troops across the Arctic corridor. $294 million for the expansion of 2 Arctic airports to accommodate larger military and civilian aircraft. The total scope of the investment represents a quantum leap in Canada's ability to project military power and enforce sovereignty across the 40% of its landmass that sits above the 60th parallel territory that, until very recently, Canada had largely left to American protection under NORAD. Carney's words at the announcement were not diplomatic. They were declaratory. "With this plan, we are taking control of our future," he said. "We will no longer rely on others to defend our Arctic security or to fuel our economy. We are taking full responsibility for defending our sovereignty." That phrase, "we will no longer rely on others," was directed at one address, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Everyone in the room knew it. Every analyst covering it knew it. Every ally watching it knew it. Canada was not just building military bases, Canada was serving notice. But the implications reach far beyond the bilateral US-Canada relationship. Consider what is happening to the American position in North America right now. The United States has spent 75 years constructing an architecture of alliances and economic relationships that made American power self-reinforcing. Partners tied themselves to Washington because Washington provided security, stability, and market access. That architecture is eroding in real time, and Canada is Exhibit A. If Canada, America's closest ally, America's largest trading partner, America's NORAD partner, the country that shares a 9,000-kilometer undefended border with the United States, if Canada is now building military bases to guard against American intentions, building new trade corridors to reduce American economic leverage, and standing in Oslo pledging to protect European sovereignty from American territorial ambitions, then the question that should terrify every serious strategic thinker in Washington is this: who else is watching? Japan is watching, South Korea is watching, the European Union is watching, Australia is watching. Every nation that built its security and economic framework around the assumption of American reliability is now watching Canada, taking notes, and asking themselves whether they need a plan B. And here is where the trade war calculus gets genuinely ironic. The United States is, on paper, winning the tariff revenue war. By the numbers, the U.S. Treasury has collected somewhere between $12 and $15 billion from Canadian imports in the first half of 2025 alone. Canada's retaliatory tariffs have generated a smaller counter-collection, roughly $20 billion US dollars from American goods, but spread across a much narrower range of sectors. So Washington is collecting more money, technically. But here is what Washington has lost that no tariff revenue can replace. It has lost Canada's unconditional alignment. It has lost Canada's strategic dependence. It has lost the assumption that when America pushes, Canada folds. It has accelerated Canada's trade diversification by years, possibly decades. It has motivated a multi-billion-dollar Canadian military buildup specifically designed to reduce reliance on American protection. It has driven Canada into the arms of the Nordic nations, the European Union, the Indo-Pacific, and Southeast Asia. It has given Canadian politicians the domestic mandate to pursue economic independence, not as an aspiration, but as an existential national project. And the most staggering number in this entire story? Canadian tourism to the United States dropped 33% year over year by June 2025. Border crossings by car fell 38% in May alone. The ripple effect through American border communities, Florida's hotel industry, American agricultural buyers, and cross-border supply chains is being measured in billions of lost revenue and in jobs. Analysts estimate that a sustained 10% decline in Canadian tourism could threaten up to 140,000 American jobs. Not Canadian jobs, American jobs. The tariffs that were supposed to punish Canada are costing American workers. That is the trade war reality that rarely makes the front page, and there is still no deal in sight. Trump has repeatedly signaled disinterest in a resolution. He famously said of the Canada situation, this could just be a tariff, not really a negotiation. His administration ended trade talks in October 2025, not over a major policy dispute, but because an Ontario government advertisement quoted Ronald Reagan criticizing protectionism. Trump accused Canada of fraudulently interfering in American politics. Talks collapsed. Meanwhile, Canada is not waiting. Canada has been very clear through every channel, in every public statement, and through every concrete policy action it has taken. Canada will not sign any deal that is not in Canada's interest. Canada will not negotiate from a position of desperation. Canada is playing a long game, and it is structurally reinforcing that long game every week with every trade agreement signed, every military dollar committed, and every alliance deepened. Carney put it most bluntly in a speech that circulated widely. The old relationship we had with the United States is over. Not paused. Not damaged. Over. Here's what that means not just for Canada, not just for the United States, but for the world. We are living through the end of an era. The post-Cold War order, the one built on American economic dominance, American security guarantees, American-led institutions is cracking, not because of China, not because of Russia, not because of some distant rival power. It is cracking because of decisions made in Washington by an administration that apparently calculated that economic coercion would bring allies to heel and that no one would have the courage or the capacity to respond in kind. Canada just proved that calculation wrong. A country of 40 million people, bearing the full weight of tariffs imposed by the largest economy in human history, looked at its options and said, we choose transformation, we choose sovereignty, we choose the long game over the easy deal. We choose to build something new instead of preserving something that no longer serves us. That choice has consequences that will shape North American and global politics for a generation. Because when Canada stood in Oslo and pledged to defend Greenland's right to self-determination, it wasn't just making a statement about Greenland, it was making a statement about what kind of international order Canada intends to help build and what kind of order it refuses to accept. When Canada announced $32 billion in Arctic military investment, it wasn't just defending its northern border. It was declaring that it will no longer outsource its sovereignty to any power, including its closest ally. When Canada signed trade agreements with Europe, deepened ties with Asia, pursued an ASEAN free trade framework, and committed to doubling its non-American exports, it wasn't just hedging against tariffs. It was dismantling the structural dependency that made it vulnerable in the first place. And here is the final irony, the one that history will record most starkly. Trump used tariffs to pressure Canada. He wanted compliance. He wanted concessions. He wanted to demonstrate that economic might translates into political submission. What he got instead was the accelerated emergence of a more independent, more militarily capable, more diplomatically active Canada, one that is now building Arctic bases, hosting summits with NATO allies, pursuing trade deals across 5 continents, and telling the world in plain language that the old rules no longer apply. He didn't break Canada, he built a stronger one. And the question that no one in Washington seems to be asking loudly enough is this: if this is what happened to Canada, America's closest friend, its most integrated partner, the country that has shared a continent peacefully for 2 centuries, then what signal does that send to every other nation that has built its future around American reliability? That answer is being written right now in Oslo boardrooms, in Tokyo trade ministries, in Berlin defense councils, and in Seoul security briefings. Every one of those governments is drawing its own conclusions. Every one of them is building its own plan B. The tariffs were supposed to be a pressure campaign. They turned into a wake-up call for Canada, for the world, and eventually, perhaps, for Washington itself. The game changed. Canada changed it, and nothing about the North American order will ever be quite the same again. If you found this breakdown valuable, hit the like button right now. It genuinely helps this content reach people who need to understand what's actually happening in this relationship. Subscribe if you're not already, because we cover exactly this kind of story, the geopolitical shifts happening beneath the headlines that nobody is connecting the dots on. Drop a comment below. Do you think Canada's long-game strategy is going to work? Or is the economic pain of this trade war going to force a deal before Canada achieves real independence? I want to hear your take. Stay sharp. We'll see you on the next one.